Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. We are currently in the midst of the Olympic Games. That's what we're focusing on today in our look at all things ancient. If we stumble across a fake fact about ancient history, you should hear this noise. That's the sound of our starter pistol misfiring. Right, everyone, on your marks, get set and go. Okay, taking an early lead here, we have Zenia representing ancient Rome. She's always got a fun fact in store for us, so expect to learn a thing or two as she progresses. Right, next up and hot on her heels is Meg, who is competing for ancient Greece. I can see Meg having the edge here. Her specialty is the birthplace of the Olympics and she's got her eyes on the olive wreath. Hold on though, here we have Barney, an experienced contender, representing the ancient Near East. Now, he is covering a lot of ground here. You do not want to underestimate this guy's ability to spit facts. And bringing up the rear, limping towards the finish line, it's me, Flo. I don't know much about the ancient world, or sports for that matter, but I'm excited to learn, along with you, our listener, all about the ancient Olympics. So at the time that this podcast goes out, we'll actually be midway through the Olympics, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the Olympics. I don't know about you guys, but I always get really emotional actually around the Olympics, because I just think it's amazing. Like all these sports people doing their best, and it doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. They're just pushing the limits of human capacity, and I really think that's something so special.
I get what you mean, because it's the culmination of a huge amount of training and effort and travelling around the world to all be in the same place, which I think is quite a special occasion. And of course it's immediately followed by the Paralympics as well, where you get the same sort of feeling of achievement and training. And it's a lovely event. And of course it was supposed to be happening last year, wasn't it? Until that pesky coronavirus stepped in.
Damn it.
I know. But I know a tiny weeny bit about the origins of the Olympics because of a project I was doing at work. And I think that the Olympics were originally shorter than they are at the moment. Were they under a week? Meg, you might be the best person to answer this, the original Olympics.
Yeah, they were sort of a few days long, and it kind of depended on what period we're talking about, because obviously the ancient Olympics ran for a really, really long time. Like they started the first recorded Olympics we have is 776 BC, and they went on and on and on right through into the Roman period, which then you'll be able to tell us about. So there's different kind of types of Olympics, and they vary in length in that time. But yeah, they had many fewer events. So like some people say that for the first I think 13 Olympics, there's basically only one event, and that's a foot running race. So there wasn't anything like the same number of events, and you might only have one competition, and then gradually they increase it until by the end you get loads of different events. But some of them are added and then disappear. So there's like a pentathlon for boys, which appears once and then disappears again, and you're like, what happened? Why would they cancel it? And like mule racing, so racing with mules instead of horses, which is kind of briefly popular and then goes away again. So it really varies what kind of time we're talking about.
I think that the time frame that I am familiar with is a 5-day one, where the middle day is a feast, and that is what I'd be sort of at the level of competitiveness. I could take part in that particular event, but it was a very religious thing, wasn't it? So the Olympics had more of a religious slant than a sort of just a sporting event.
Yeah, hugely. So the whole Olympics, they're sort of part of a religious festival honouring Zeus. And the original Olympics actually took place in the sanctuary of Zeus. So as the Olympics get like bigger and bigger, as I've just been saying, they then sort of built a stadium a bit further away, so you're not literally running in like the sanctuary. The olive wreaths, the award, are again from this kind of sacred olive grove. So hugely religious all the way through, which is very different from what it's like now, I think.
Is that sanctuary of Zeus, is that one of the wonders of the ancient world? Is that the temple to Zeus at Olympia, or am I thinking of something else?
No, it is that one. And there's a statue there, a very famous statue of Zeus. So the temple of Zeus built at Olympia was absolutely massive. It was almost as big as the Acropolis. So that was like a really important site. And one of the wonders of the ancient world.
I have an image of that statue in my head from Hercules, I think. I don't know if it's literally supposed to be that, but when he goes and meets the giant statue of his dad, like that's what I hope that it looked like back in the day.
I think it's pretty big. I think it's like multiple meters tall, but maybe not Maybe not quite what it appears in the Hercules film.
When I was a child watching Hercules, I conflated the Abraham Lincoln on a chair statue with Zeus in that part of the film. Do you know the statue I mean?
That is so funny. I was going to say exactly the same thing. Was that based on the Lincoln Memorial? Was it based on the statue of Zeus?
Was it based on the film Hercules?
We're asking the serious questions here on Against the Law. So the Olympics is really important to us today, but I gather that it was so important at the time during the original Olympics that for a stretch of history at least, all warfare was put on hold while the Olympics took place. Now, is that true?
Yes, and I think we've mentioned this before in travel. There was a sort of, because the Olympics is a religious festival, you're a pilgrim if you're attending the Olympics. So you have a sort of individual protection in that you shouldn't be attacked because if you're going to the Olympics, that's a pilgrimage basically. But also there was a sort of sacred truce. So it's not like no war can happen anywhere, and some war did still happen, but it's like an armistice that basically fighting that would interfere with the Olympics is banned while the Olympics are happening. And Sparta obviously wants get in trouble for breaking that, and they get fined loads of money.
I really like the idea that a Greek parent at the time of the Olympics, if their kids started fighting, could just be like, don't do that, the Olympics is on.
I do think I found an against the law though while I was doing this project at work. For clarity's sake, I work in software, so it's completely unrelated to the Olympics, and it's a convoluted reason why I was talking about the Olympics. But I found something against the law, which is that the lighting of the torch is a modern invention. So of course we have olive wreaths, which is a historical thing, and has always been a historical thing. But nobody ever used to do light torches and take them on a relay race around ancient Greece.
That's true. It is a modern invention as it appears in the modern Olympics. However, it is derived, I think, from various different things in ancient Greece. So like in the Olympics in ancient Greece, which obviously took place in Olympia, there would be a flame burning in like an altar in one of the temples, this is a kind of a big thing. Like you'll have a sort of flame burning in a temple to sort of signify, it's a sacred place and people are the flame keepers. And so the idea of a flame is quite important. But also there was a procession at the beginning of the ancient Olympics, because the Olympics were kind of run from a city-state called Elis. That's where the Olympics are kind of managed out of. But Olympia, I think it's a 36-mile walk from there. So the Olympics actually starts with this procession from Elis to Olympia to kind of begin it, and it's led by the people who manage the whole thing. So they're kind of combining the idea of a procession and the idea of the important sacred flame there into what we now have.
So did they have the Queen parachute in for the procession, or is that's modern, isn't it, Meg?
No, Flo, that actually did take place. Daniel Craig was also there, I think. Yeah, no, some weird similarities there.
Absolutely.
I think that might be our first counter against the law ever.
What a deliberate falsehood. Yeah, for clarity, listeners, that is not true. If any of you believed.
That means like there was an against the law, and then we were like, no, within the law.
It is the law.
It is the law. It's permitted. Motion dismissed.
I'm going to start like a sort of splinter podcast called Within the Law, where I just
You just affirm everything.
Yeah. So maybe the Queen didn't parachute back in, but we did have those opening processions, which I quite like. So, sorry, Meg, I'm going to stick with you for a little bit longer. You mentioned that there was a religious aspect to it. So you mentioned Zeus, obviously, in the temple. But were there any other gods or religious characters or historical figures who were intertwined with the Olympics that you've got stories from?
Great question, Flo. Many. There's the Haraya, which is a festival which took place every 4 years, also at Olympia, probably about the same time as the Olympics. And the Haraya is a festival where, in honour of Hera, where young girls compete in like a foot race. So that's all about Hera, which that's also important, but not technically part of the Olympics.
So the Olympics, as we know it now, takes place anywhere in the world. At the moment, it's in Japan, isn't it? Did the Olympics originally move around, or was it in one place?
No, yeah, very much in one place in Olympia, as its name suggests. There were other festivals in different parts of Greece, other sort of games held, but the Olympics was by far the most important. And Olympia is named after Mount Olympus, where all the ancient Greek gods and goddesses were thought to live. But, a little against the law here, Olympus is nowhere near Olympia. So this place called Olympia, where the games take place, is in the Peloponnese, whereas Mount Olympus is like North Greece.
Nice. Whenever I hear about Olympus, I always think of the song Africa by Toto, where the lyric is rises like Mount Olympus above the Serengeti, which is possibly more against the law, against the geography, than we could ever muster up on this podcast. So obviously during the Olympics people get injured, they pull a hamstring, a javelin goes awry, hits someone in the face, it happens. Were chariot races a part of the Olympics, and were they as dangerous as I think they are?
Yeah, chariot racing, big thing. In the ancient Greek Olympics, you get both 2-horse chariot races and 4-horse chariot races, and they were super dangerous because there'd be loads and loads of chariots on the track. And when you get to the end, you have to turn around the turning point. There's a thing in the ground which you have to go round, and obviously everyone is trying to do that. And the closer you get to the turning point, the quicker you'll go. But that also means you're at risk of hitting it and crashing into everyone. So that they were one of the really popular ones because there was almost always a crash. I think there was one where only one chariot actually finished the race because everybody else had crashed.
Wow, I don't know if I could watch that. That's like when you watch monster trucks or something, or like Formula One racing. That's hiding behind the sofa level watching, I think.
Yeah, very dangerous sport. It was especially popular in Roman times, actually, chariot racing. And the Emperor Nero, he was obsessed with chariot racing in particular, but he was also very into the sport of ancient Greece as well. And so he decided to arrange for himself a tour of Greece. And as Meg mentioned before, like there were actually lots of different sporting festivals, of which the Olympics were sort of the biggest one. What Nero did was he made all of the festivals happen when he happened to be in Greece, which, as you can imagine, messed up all of these athletes' training schedules. And actually, the source that talks about this said that some of these festivals ended up having to happen twice just so that he could go to them. And in the Olympics that happened in the year that he went, he decided to take part in the chariot race. But 4 horses was not good enough for him. No. He wanted a 10-horse chariot, which, initially you think, wow, 10 horses, that's just going to be a lot faster, that's going to win. But actually, controlling that number of horses is extremely difficult. It's hard enough controlling 2 or even 4 horses going around these tight corners. And so, yeah, within the first few minutes, Nero's 10-horse chariot just completely collapsed. He couldn't finish the race, but he was crowned the winner anyway because he was the emperor, and effectively Greece got a tax break for letting him win. But after his death, the entire Olympics of that year was scratched from the historical record because they were so embarrassed.
Oh, so like just rewrite the records, pretend it never happened, move on.
Yeah, just like, oh my gosh, do you remember that time when our entire religious festival was compromised by a really selfish emperor? Yeah, let's not remember that. That was horrible.
Is another dangerous sport wrestling? Because I seem to, in my head, think that Olympics had a lot to do with wrestling, and I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, so there's a event at the Olympics called the Pancration, which was introduced quite early on, I think in sort of the 7th century BC, which is like boxing and wrestling and kicking. I think it's been compared to like MMA because it's a real combination of things, and it was really quite dangerous. It wasn't the most dangerous. I think boxing was seen as the most dangerous just because of the sheer force of a punch. But yeah, the Pancration was a good one to watch. Often lots of injuries. One guy died but still won. This is a guy called Orychion, and he was suffocated to death by his opponent, but just before that he managed to break the opponent's toe, so the opponent withdrew, and then Orychion's corpse was pronounced the winner.
Is that what you'd call a Pyrrhic victory?
It is, Faye. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like, really quite Pyrrhic. He's dead at the end. So
I've just used Pyrrhic victory and I don't know if I fully understand it. Is a Pyrrhic victory when you technically win but at a cost so great that you might as well not have done?
Yeah, exactly. So it comes from a battle where the victors were very much like they won, but they had lost so many men and everything had gone so badly that they might as well not have done.
Yeah, it was a guy called Pyrrhus who was fighting against the Romans. So that's why it's called Pyrrhic, because Pyrrhus won, but yeah, at too much cost to himself.
Do you reckon when he was getting his toe fixed up, he said, "You should see the other guy"?
Yeah. Definitely. There's also a kind of on the sort of note of types of victories. There's also a type of victory in the Pancration and in other things, but I think especially in the Pancration where you win by default because everyone is too scared to face you, and that's called a sort of akoniti victory, which means without getting dust on you. So you haven't even fought, you haven't even been sort of dusted off afterwards. You've just won because everyone else is too scared.
That's such a cool word. I love that. What's that again, Meg?
Akoniti. So it means without. So the A is like, the negative, the sort of like, I don't know, asexual or whatever. But then the dust, I was like, okay, that means they didn't have to roll around in the dust. But actually, I looked it up and I think it's the tradition of, so after you've competed and you've been sort of oiled, you then get this dust or sand sort of patted into you at the end. So I think that's actually what it means, rather than like not kind of tumbling in the dust, but you don't get, because you haven't fought at all, you don't get this dust put on you at the end. So I think that's quite an interesting one.
So on the subject of wrestling, and bearing in mind that the ancient Near East isn't going to be able to supply very much Olympics information, there's a couple of bits of evidence of wrestling in the ancient Near East, both literary and real. The real one, and evidence of it actually going on, comes from these really beautiful tombs in Egypt, in a place called Beni Hassan. And they're the tombs of these officials. And it was in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, which is probably one of the most unloved ones. It's not the Old Kingdom, so it's not pyramids, and it's not the New Kingdom, so it's not Tutankhamun and Ramesses. And they loved depicting daily life in the Middle Kingdom, in their burial goods and on their tomb walls and stuff like that. And so there's this one tomb in Beni Hassan that's got sports and just, fun kind of activities all over the walls, like juggling and acrobatics and wrestling. And it's all these different stages of different positions in wrestling, and there's loads of them, and it's wonderful. So bearing in mind that they really like to depict daily life in this particular period in Egypt, it's sort of evidence that people did take part in the act of wrestling. But yeah, over in the ancient Near East, wrestling was more like a kind of heroic thing. Like you can imagine Gilgamesh wrestled quite a lot. Him and his frenemy Enkidu, they wrestled when they first met. Big wrestle, destroyed the temple in Uruk. And people wore these girdles, I think, they're depicted in seals and stuff like that. So the idea, I think, was that you'd be trying to grab a hold of the other people's girdles and flip them over and stuff. So, but they were also big on wrestling animals as well. So you might wrestle a bull or a lion, and that would be a way for a leader, really, a king, to show his domination of the natural world.
I feel like wrestling a lion is quite a bad idea.
Did ancient sports people, did they get medals or cups or anything like that, or is that completely modern?
So I think I mentioned earlier, in the ancient Olympics, you get your olive crown if you win the Olympics, because again, you get these olive trees growing in the sanctuary. But that does depend. So that's the Olympics specifically. But in the other games that aren't the Olympics, but other big sporting festivals, you get different things, and they're kind of, the Olympics is the most important. And then the poet Pindar says the Olympics is the greatest of the games, but there are the other ones. There's the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Nemean Games. And those Nemeans, the last ones, you get wild celery as your prize, which is quite nice, I think. So it kind of depends where you are, which games you're partaking in. But yeah, olive crowns is the main one. And then there are obviously other games that those four are the most important, partly because they're done for, the glory of winning. But there are other ones where you would win like masses of prizes.
I quite like that, though. Like, you're taking part it's more of a community-minded thing, isn't it, then?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially as it went on, I think originally it might have been more like individuals, but as it went on, it seems like it became more, you're representing your city-state, and you'd get like a hero's welcome when you come home, which is nice. We still get that, don't we? Do you remember those the letterboxes that were painted for Olympic gold medals? And
oh yeah. So were there any ancient ball games?
I had picked up a little reference that, in fact, ball games were nowhere near as popular in the ancient world as they are in the modern day. And bearing that in mind, the only potential one that might exist in the ancient Near East is on such shaky foundations that they can't even confirm whether it's real or not. But luckily, our best friend Gilgamesh is here. At the start of the epic, Gilgamesh is supposed to be this tyrant who abuses the people of Uruk. He takes advantage of the women, and he physically drains the men by training and keeping them active all the time. And in one translation, and it's a contested word, so again, very shaky here, he's supposed to be keeping them up with something called a puku, which they think might be a ball or a stick. And then in the Sumerian version of the epic, both puku and miku are included. And so they think that both of those together are a ball and stick, a bit like modern hockey. So there's potential that in the town of Uruk, Gilgamesh was whipping everyone up into a frenzy by playing this ball game. But really, there's not much more than that.
No offense to Gilgamesh, but that kind of sounds like enforced corporate fun. Like, you know, when you have a... Do you know what I mean? Like, it sounds like when you go to do a work thing and they're like, right, we're all gonna get a hacky sack and we're all gonna throw it at the person who is the most behind on deadlines. Watch out, Susan. Do you know what I mean? No offense, Gilgamesh. He'd been through a lot, to be fair, or he was about to go through a lot.
Yeah, not by that point. I think he was still a bit of a colossal waste man.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess there's a sense that he's kind of wasting the time of the people of the city with a trivial game.
Barney, that board game reminds me of that scene in The Road to El Dorado. You know, where the two guys, they think they're gods and they have to play the game, the gods ball game against this really experienced team.
When they have to get it through the hoop really high up on the wall.
Yeah. And it's just the idea of like play ball. It's like, was it really just called ball?
I think, do you know, actually, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that's in The Road to El Dorado and presumably in the Mesoamerican traditions that's based off. That was for the gods, right? Yes.
So the I think it's based on this like Aztec version of the game, or it's called Mesoamerican ball game, but it's also called things like Pocketok. The only reason that I know all this is because when I was about 7, I had a CD disc ROM for PC about Aztecs, and that was one of the games on it. So I was delighted when I saw El Dorado, the Road to El Dorado, and I saw this this ball game included.
Really like that style of naming, Mesoamerican ball game.
It's good, isn't it?
But yeah, Games for Gods is maybe the closest thing you'd have to something Olympic-like in the ancient Near East. And so in the Middle Assyrian period, we're getting all the middle periods today. There might be a trend notice that they're never of much interest for Egypt and the ancient Near East. Sorry, this is very cruel to anyone who's an expert in those periods, but for some reason they always seem to be slightly overlooked. But yeah, there's a Middle Assyrian text from about 1200 BC that dedicates to a god that young men, the strong ones, will fight each other in trials of strength before you. Again, it's quite scant, but there is evidence that they were hosting these kind of trials of strength and maybe games in honor of particular gods in certain cities.
That sounds very Olympian. Another origin story for the Olympics is that a guy called Heracles, but not the Heracles you're thinking of, a different one, was guarding baby Zeus on Mount Olympus. Little baby Zeus, because obviously Zeus at risk of being eaten by his father Kronos, which is maybe a story for a different day. But anyway, Heracles.
What? What? Just in case he needs a snack?
Yeah.
Because what?
So
Heracles is babysitting baby Zeus so that Zeus's dad Kronos isn't like, I've got some pickles, I've got some ketchup, I've got some slices of cheese. Zeus is looking like a very tasty option right now. So yeah, Heracles is babysitting Zeus. Gotcha.
It's because Kronos thought that he was going to be overthrown by his children, or one of his children, so he would eat them. But Zeus escapes that. And is Heracles, but not the one you're thinking of, a different Heracles, is guarding him. And to pass the time, he would do running races with his brothers, Heracles. And that's another potential origin for the Olympics, is Heracles kind of, running while babysitting. What a multitasker.
running is maybe where the ancient Near East could provide a little more information about things that could be considered sports. And as usual, it's the kings who are getting into these sort of things. There's a Sumerian king called Shulgi who said that on the day of a religious festival, he ran between Ur, the city of Ur, and the city of Nippur. And these are very far apart in Mesopotamia. Like Ur is down near the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and Nippur is slap bang in the middle of Mesopotamia, right in between the two rivers. And he was saying that he could run between the two in order to make an appearance at both festivals.
Was he supposed to compete when he got to the other end?
No, it's just flexing.
Oh my goodness.
So he's supposed to be just showing up, like a music festival kind of thing, like if someone got helicoptered between two locations. But Shulgi said he was going to run it. So this was a 200-mile round trip. Was this, Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, can hit 50 degrees, I think, at times, Celsius. And so perhaps, this was maybe later in the year and in the cooler times, but still, I think presumably impossible. Very ultra marathon vibes.
Yeah, I mean, this puts the marathon distance to shame, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, imagine Forrest Gumping your way all the way across Mesopotamia just to flex.
There's one more race. It's a modern race that was inspired by the ancient world, and it's inspired by ancient Egypt. So again, in a similar way that the Olympics has been set up around the ancient event, there's an Egyptian king later on in Egyptian history called Taharqa. And he was a Kushite king, which meant that he came from what is modern-day Sudan. And he was renowned to have kept his army incredibly well trained, including very long runs through what is essentially the desert in Egypt. And he was said to have made his army run regularly from Memphis, which is the sort of most revered capital of ancient Egypt, and just south of Giza, where the pyramids are, all the way down to the Fayum, which is an oasis about 100 kilometers south.
Wow.
His soldiers were supposed to do that. And anyway, it's been recreated in modern times as this kind of pyramid ultra marathon. Because if you go south in that direction, you pass all of the non-Giza pyramids, the other ones like the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the Bent Pyramid at Dashur, all these sorts of things. And so that 100 kilometers people now do as a modern ultra marathon, again, in the desert, in the heat in Egypt.
That's amazing. There's also a thing called a Sparta Athlon now, which is obviously again a modern race, which is kind of another ultra marathon, which tracks what's the most accurate historical version of the original marathon. So you guys were saying earlier about that's much longer than a marathon, but the actual original marathon was much longer than a marathon, because the story of a guy called Phidipides, there's sort of two different versions of it. One where he runs from Marathon, where this battle is taking place in 490 BC, back to Athens to announce victory, but then immediately dies. So that would be about the distance of a modern marathon, but that's kind of like people are unsure about that story, and it comes from a bit later. Whereas Herodotus, writing much closer to the time, says that Phidipides actually runs from Athens to Sparta to get help for the Battle of Marathon. And that is a really long way. That's like 150 miles. And he gets there and back in 3 days. And in the 1980s, a load of RAF commanders went to Greece to do on an official expedition to see whether it's possible to do that run from Athens to Sparta in about a day and a half. And 3 of them did it. And it's now an ultramarathon called the Sparta Athlon.
That's amazing.
Can I lower the tone? Because I feel like that's very much my place in this podcast. And just ask about nudity. You know what I'm going to ask? Did people compete in the nudie?
Yes. Yes, they did. The Greeks definitely competed naked. Various different explanations for why they might have done that. Some say it's the Spartans who started it. Some say it's because someone was running and then tripped over their clothes and then lost. And some say it's because someone was running and tripped over their clothes but then won, so they were quicker without clothes. But yeah, they did compete naked, and they would get themselves all oiled up, which was apparently also like a sun cream situation, that they'd be naked but covered in oil, which that doesn't make sense to me. Again, not very good at oil
makes you burn more.
Yeah, I think that's what I would imagine, but whatever, they knew what they were doing. And then they would run naked, and after they'd finished, they would do this thing where they'd be naked and covered in oil, and they would scrape the oil from their bodies and put it into small bottles and sell it, and it was called gloios. So it's a kind of combination of sweat and oil, and it's meant to help you with things like genital infections.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yo, that is not cool.
It's not a nice thought, but just to kind of shout out to the Romans, apparently they thought it was really weird. They'd be like, have you seen what these Greeks are doing with their sweaty naked oil? So even at the time, people were a bit suspicious.
And then they went and did the same with the gladiators. So such hypocrisy there from the Romans.
Do you reckon the Romans were like, hey, listen, when in Rome?
Nice.
Except of course they weren't in any you know what I mean. Anyway,
Maybe they had somewhere else that was the object of their when in X.
like, when in Slough.
Oh, actually, I do have a really interesting thing that I came across the other day that's kind of this perception of one place from the perspective of somewhere else, but within the ancient world. In the Bible, which can be viewed as a historical source, the book of Acts mostly tells the story of the Apostle Paul's journeys around the ancient world. And he goes to Athens to preach the gospel. And it's really funny because the author of Acts says that Paul got to Athens and he was like, and then these guys in Athens, okay, so they do this really weird thing of just standing around in the agora talking about life. And from a classics perspective, that is so funny because that's kind of what we read about, isn't it, Meg, with the philosophers in Athens? And it's like from this Jewish perspective, going to Athens and being like, yeah, they just stand around and chat all day.
That's amazing.
That's called defamiliarization, right?
When you see your own subject from a different perspective?
Yeah, that's my GCSE English right there.
I love that. I love reading different people's accounts of different civilizations throughout history. I feel like I've run a marathon, partly because it's about 25 degrees and I'm sweating. So I feel like that was quite a nice fitting sensory experience to go alongside this podcast. So as I deodorize, let's have a think about our favourite facts that we've learned today. Barney, I'm going to start with you. What was your favourite thing that you learned today?
I really liked the Against the Law supplied by Meg about Olympus versus Olympia, and the fact that they were nowhere near each other. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I quite like that too. It's really interesting. Meg, how about you?
I really liked hearing about Nero's experiences with the Olympics. I think he is fascinating, and I just love the idea that he was so determined to win despite maybe not having that much skill. I think that's amazing.
I think that's blasphemy, Meg. I think you'll find that actually he was a very good sportsman.
Yeah, no, sorry. Can we edit that out? I don't want to die.
Zenia, how about you? What was your favourite thing you learned?
So my favourite thing was this idea of someone not having any competitors in a competition and becoming the default winner. Was it akonete, the word?
Akonete, yeah.
In a similar vein, my favourite thing that I've learnt today is about the wrestler who got a toe broken but conceded victory to his dead opponent because it was the right thing to do.
I don't even think he thought it was the right thing to do. I think he was just in so much pain from the toe that he withdrew. So, which, does he put things into perspective, given that his opponent was literally dead.
But on the plus side, we've got the Olympics to look forward to and enjoy. And I'm really looking forward to that and the Paralympics as well afterwards.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Against the Law. If you can't get enough and are keen for extra content, don't forget to follow us on Twitter @AgainstLaw, and we're on TikTok too. And if you enjoyed this episode, please support us on Patreon. We have different support tiers depending on how much you can spare each month, and each one comes with a special reward to say thank you. We love to hear from you, so please reach out to us with questions or comments on Twitter or email againstthelawpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, bye!